Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Dr. Mike Martin, who is a former British Army officer and who has since become a prominent speaker and writer on conflict, particularly its causes. He has published several books on the subject, most notably one which has landed him in some hot water, as we'll shortly discuss. It's titled An Intimate War, An Oral History of the Helmand Conflict, 1978 to 2012. He's also recently published a book called Why We Fight, which is a deep dive into the evolutionary reasons for war and conflict. More recently, Mike has also been engaged by the Australian Defence Force to deliver a course on the impact cultural understanding can have on a conflict. And this is a way to improve our collective understanding of the conflicts we have been a part of and are likely to be involved with in the future. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Maz. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into your experiences of war and the subsequent research, maybe we'll go back to what made you initially join the military.
I think I'd always wanted to go to war. I'm sure many young boys have this aged 10 or something. They all play commandos or whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I obviously did that, but I also had quite a deep interest in war, which has now become my profession. But I guess I felt driven to it in the same way. I guess that people are driven to become a doctor or a teacher. Like it's a vocation, right?
Yeah.
Warrior is a kind of ancient vocation in the human species, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I can personally relate to that as well. I think as a young fella, my first title was soldier, veteran Masley soldier. I was 3, so I can certainly connect to that. But when you, mind you, this was in Bosnia, right? This was in
my
Bosnia.
Friends used to call me command. Well, no, but right.
Yeah.
And my friends used to call me Commando Michael, or a
right.
So that was, I guess they were taking the piss, but there's the reason why taking the piss works is because there's some truth in it, isn't there? So.
Yeah, and I guess it's something one identifies with, right? And it's especially when it becomes a name or a title or a nickname that one associates with. I mean, I know it certainly was for me, and has followed me throughout my life, and ultimately made me join the military. But I think it's interesting because I mean I've joined the military after I've experienced war, and those listeners of my podcast will already know that I've experienced the Bosnian conflict to an extent as a young kid, which shaped my orientation towards conflict. What shaped your orientation towards conflict? I mean, you said you've kind of wanted to from an early age wanted to be a warrior, Commando Mike. Was that the trigger? Was that what actually, you dove into the deep, murky waters?
I didn't. It was. So I read a lot. Loads of people read a lot, but I really was and am, I guess, a bookworm. And when I say I was interested in war as a youngster, it wasn't really so much the kind of bang, bang, blowing stuff up, shooting people's side of warfare. That, obviously that's really exciting. And, having done some of that, I can attest to the fact that that's just one of the most exciting things, if not the most exciting thing that you can do. But it was actually the political side of warfare, or where war meets society, or the negotiations that surround violence or military conflict, I guess. So, the books I read when I was a youngster were often like things like King Solomon's Mines or Beau Geste or books about political officers or like Wilfred Thesiger, stuff like that, where you've got a kind of combination of exploration, both like physical and over terrain, but also actually mostly societal,
Yeah.
combined with speaking the local languages and carrying out some kind of task. And I'm not obviously defending colonialism. Most of these books are reflective of the colonial era, right? But they were trying to carry out some kind of task, and they were doing it in a particularly like politically astute way, I guess, through knowledge of the local societies and ability to understand and navigate through that terrain. And occasionally that meant using violence, and occasionally it didn't. But it was that, I guess, that border between politics and speaking and war and fighting, I guess, has always fascinated me.
Yeah.
Like it's a threshold that is probably not as distinct as we imagine. Like I think we, particularly us in kind of Western advanced economies, tend to think of war as an on or off thing. Like there either is peace or there's war. Whereas it's not that. That threshold I see is obviously stretched out, because violence is a method of communication and all those sorts of things. And so people use that to send messages when they're unable to send other messages, or they use violence in combination with messages that they've delivered verbally. And so I guess that fascination with war really at heart is a kind of fascination with humans, and war is just an extreme environment that brings out some of the more extreme aspects of humanity, or I guess makes them more obvious to see, because people are forced to take positions in war that they wouldn't otherwise take, maybe. And so war strips away, if you like, the airs and graces and lays bare the raw humanity. And I don't, by using the term humanity there, I don't mean, he's that was a humanitarian gesture. I don't mean it in that sense. By humanity, I mean the raw humanity in all of its glory, whether good or bad. The rawness of human emotions, I think, are laid bare in a conflict, and through studying conflicts you can actually learn a huge amount about humanity and about society and about the societies we've created and how we interact with others and how those societies interact with other societies, and so on and so forth.
It removes, I guess, that fragile veneer of society that we hold so dear to our hearts. I mean, and I think hit the nail on the head with war, brings it down to the component parts of what it means to be human, right? We'll look at coronavirus in Australia. We saw the fragile, this idea of a peaceful democratic society just shatter over toilet paper. And I think that's it's laughable, but I think it speaks to that very point, right? That it is something so fundamentally human, which is fascinating. I think that's a far deeper, more nuanced appreciation of war and conflict that most people hold, and also a much more, I think, noble reason to get into the profession of arms. And I think it's important to note here that you deployed to Afghanistan, but you're also a fluent Pashto speaker, right?
Yeah.
How did that come about? I mean, so we'll talk about the actual conflict and Afghan later, but why did you even learn the language, and how easy or hard is it to even become fluent in language?
Yeah. So if I could just come to that in 2 secs, because you just said something there that made me think of this kind of quite important point, which is that there's a tradition of kind of philosopher soldiers or soldier scholars in many societies, and often some of the most philosophical, the deepest thinkers I've met have been soldiers, because they've been faced with this rawness of humanity. And I think that we denigrate that, or we ignore that, or we don't sustain that and support that at our peril. Because if you don't have people thinking deeply about conflict, and by that I don't mean like professional military education, I don't think that really it just doesn't touch the sides. I mean thinking really deeply about the undercurrents and the fundamentals of conflict. I think you have a huge problem. It's a bit like, you know, was it Trotsky's or Lenin's? I'm not sure who it's attributed to, but that phrase, you know, if you're not, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think that this idea of the soldier scholar or the philosopher soldier or whatever you want to call it actually is something that we need to nurture and encourage amongst our soldiers, and particularly amongst our politicians. Ultimately, you know, in our you know, in the UK and Australia, in democratic societies, the politicians that make fun of cool. Okay, so how did I learn push to? We'll come back to that.
We'll just no, because that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think it's worth exploring that, particularly the notion about our politicians, because I guess perhaps the point you're making is that they are the ones that are sending people in uniform, men and women, to war, but potentially they don't have the context of what war is about. If they are not, say, a philosopher soldier, or you know, somebody who's had any experience of that rawness of war, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think there's something that you can't gain about war without experiencing it. And even if you do experience it, maybe you haven't like done the requisite reading and so on and so forth to kind of, you know, interpret those feelings. But I guess what I'm saying is, you know, there is a technical way of looking at war, right? We can look at it in terms of technological acquisition, in terms of you know, statistics like our tank and their tank and weapons ranges, and we can look at it in terms of, you know, signals intelligence and networks that build up target packs and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of very technical disciplines in war, right? Like medicine. But in medicine, the doctor needs to understand all the technical disciplines, but they also need to have a bedside manner and judgment to know which of those technical disciplines to use when treating the patient. Okay. And I think it's the same in war. War has lots of science and technical disciplines in it, but actually there's an art to it. And by art, what we mean is there's something that's not rational, something that is emotional, and something that is very hard to learn from a book. You might be able to talk eloquently about the experience of war from an intellectual standpoint, right? But until you've really experienced it, it's hard for you to actually understand how that affects the outcome. And the reason it's important is kind of stuff like, if we go like, I don't know, let's look at Clausewitz, for instance, right? Is this kind of guy that we go back to, and you know, and he was a philosopher of war, really. He was, you know, and the reason his stuff is still read is because it wasn't focusing on that technical minutiae of war. It was focusing on the undercurrents. And he spoke about the fog of war, right? And if you can't understand how the fog of war affects what's going on and how that may end up with suboptimal decisions being made that then end up to situations spiraling out of control, and therefore alliances breaking down or reforming or whatever, you know, I've just given you a quick example, but like,
of course,
without having that emotional understanding of how the system itself will behave when it's put under stress, or how people will behave when it's put under stress, or without ever having experienced what it's like to fight for your own survival, then you are unlikely to be able to make good judgments about war. And, you know, a key example out of the recent wars that we've had, so Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, blah, 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 Syria, you know, it goes on, Yemen, is this we over ascribe the importance to, ideology. You see it all the time. People talk about, you know, this ideology, this right-wing ideology, or this Muslim fundamentalism or whatever, driving people to commit violent acts, or, you the extreme suicide bombing, but
Yeah.
but we're talking about the Taliban, and to take an example I know very well, described as this fundamentalist organization that's intent on imposing,
Yeah.
and
Which is such a beautiful black and white narrative, right?
it's so easy. It's so easy, right? And I would understand it if the politicians were using it to sell the war to Western publics. But it's not that. We've drunk our own Kool-Aid, and we think that that is what is causing the war, and therefore, in order to win the war, we need to do things that end up denigrating and defeating that ideology. But that's not it.
Yeah.
That's not it. Anyone who has fought for survival of themselves, for themselves or their family, understands very clearly that ideology comes well below survival.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really powerful insight, and it reminds me. I mean, when we were in Germany as refugees, my old man was in Bosnia on the front lines because obviously, he couldn't leave because he was a fighting age male. It would have been, first checkpoint, he would have been killed. So he fought on the front lines. And while we were in Germany, I was this, between the ages of, 10 and a half and 14 or something like that. Young man wanting to, becoming a man, really wanting to do my part. And, I was almost very rebellious. I was hating the Serbs. I was hating the Croats. I was fighting Germans just because that's what you did. It was just this rage and anger within me. And when my dad finally came out and joined us, he saw this in me, this rage, this hate towards these groups, like in this instance, Serbs and Croats, who, throughout the Bosnian conflict, either shot at each other or shot at, Bosnians or whatever. And I thought in my deluded sense that I was, espousing some notion of idealism or ideology and to stand up for my people. And, the first thing my dad said is, do not hate any of those sides. I've shot at both. They've all shot at me, and I don't hate them. It's not about that. That is just what's kind of superimposed on our beliefs. And that was a really shaping moment, because that kind of flipped that very narrative that you're talking about. It flipped it upside down, because here I thought I knew the answer. I thought exactly, I thought I knew who the enemy was, whatever enemy even means, right? But it was flipped just by that very notion. I think it's a very powerful insight, and one that we so quickly forget because it seems to be a simple solution to a very, very complex problem. But it leads me to another question. Yeah, sorry.
You're lucky to have had the dad that you had.
Truly, yeah, 100%. Because absolutely. Because I have seen the other, the alternative in some of my friends and counterparts whose dads
didn't have that understanding and realization,
but embraced,
weren't able to share it.
Exactly, embraced that narrative and fundamentally passed that narrative on to the next generation, which keeps it alive, right? And
but why do we embrace societal or group narratives? Part of the reason we do it is because we're terrified, and when you're terrified and scared, the very, very natural, evolutionary driven instinct is to group together with others in order to, protection in numbers. And so we lump ourselves in with a group narrative, and we genuinely consciously think we believe it. Whether we do or not is we can talk about cognition, but we genuinely believe those group narratives, because through espousing them, we're articulating our membership of those groups. We're making it clear to everyone that we're Bosnian, right? And that, because we believe X, Y, and Z about the Croats and the Serbs, we're Bosnian. Therefore, and that soothes you emotionally and calms you, because you then feel like you've got a tribe that's going to protect you when it goes wrong. And if you think about it, if everyone's doing that, then we understand how polarization occurs and how spirals happen.
And I think this is one of the key subtexts of certainly the Why We Fight book, right? That this is this sense of belonging is a key human driver, right? It's a motivator, and ultimately becomes a motivator towards violence. Is that right?
Well, basically, you have this mechanism, your brain, right, has evolved to pursue certain evolutionary goals, like finding a mate, finding food, so on and so forth, right? And the reason you pursue them is because they help you survive and reproduce, which is the whole point of evolution. And so one of those things that we pursue is belonging to a coherent social group, because it protects you, as we've just discussed. It through specialization, you get a greater share of resources than if a group of 10 is able to, one can hunt, one can whatever.
Yeah.
And then it gives you more access to like a greater variety of sexual partners than if you're kind of, so that's the kind of, that gets you out the incest trap, but also at a greater scale gives you a much greater range of sexual partners, greater choice. And so we have this kind of drive towards belonging, but the same mechanism that drives us towards belonging is also the one that divides the world into in-groups and out-groups. Because if you think about it, we could never have a mechanism that said group with everyone, because then a lineage would evolve that takes advantage of that mechanism in everyone else, and the whole system would collapse. So the only way you can evolve a stable mechanism amongst humans, that in fact amongst mammals have the same mechanism. So you see this behavior involves chimpanzees, whatever. The only way you can evolve this grouping mechanism is if you put boundaries on it. So what creates in-groups also creates out-groups at the same time. So that and it's the same mechanism, the same hormonal pathways. And so what you find is that the more people are pulled into in-groups, I am Bosnian, the more that they denigrate or espouse hatred towards out-groups, right? In terms of the unconscious mechanism. Now, of course, our conscious brain can come along and try and smooth the edges of that. And, we're all educated and liberal. So I know that, I'm British. I know that French people are just the same as us, but maybe deep down, I'm joking.
No, I understand, but if it came down to it,
there's an unconscious mechanism that is grouping the world into in-groups and out-groups, and this has the basis for all, racism,
social identity theory, right? I mean, that's
social identity, exactly, yeah. And so and they interact. The more pressure you're put in under from an out group, the more you coalesce on your in group, and the more you coalesce in your in group, the more you project denigration or hatred or whatever, negative feelings onto the out group. And there's a bunch of other sort of in group and out mechanisms, but that's the main one. And so, that's what you find in war. It's like a ratchet. It was what you find in politics as well, but like it's most extreme in war. It's a ratchet, and it clicks slightly tighter every time a leader does something or there's some sort of incident, and it clicks slightly tighter.
Yeah.
And
I guess
your question?
It's about how it leads to conflict, and it's very much you've just hit the nail on the head there. I mean, and as the more we identify with our own in group, the more we exaggerate the likeness of our group, and also the more we exaggerate the differences between us and whoever that perceived out group is.
Absolutely, and we see within our in group, we see heterogeneity, so we can see the differences in our in group, the fine differences, but the out group are all the same. They are all
that's right. Yeah, and I mean, I think, and this is maybe a good way and a good place to come back into your your learning push to, because you ultimately became, right, so if we talk, you stepped outside of the narrative of the British military officer, and you almost stepped over into a completely different narrative, and that is the local narrative of the local Afghani experience. So firstly, what was the reason that you learnt the language, and then later, how did that shape your understanding of the environment?
So I was in the British Army Reserve, and I'd just been living in South America, and I came back and I was trying to find a job in the UK, and I wanted to have a job that had travel and languages, abilities to learn language.
So had you learned any languages, other languages by this stage?
Yeah, it's French and Spanish.
Right, okay.
And I've just been living in South America for 15 months.
Right, okay.
And and then so I guess like many armies, you can move in between the reserves and the regulars, depending on what you're doing in your stage of life. And there was a scheme where you could go in full time for 3 years, which I eventually extended to 6.5. you can go in full time for 3 years, and you do 15-month course on either Pashto, Arabic, or Farsi, because at that time Iraq and Afghanistan were going on. And then you do 2 tours, 2 6-month tours, supposedly as an interpreter, and then that'll be it. You'll be done. So, and why was I driven to do that? Well, we've kind of spoken about, when I was growing up, what I wanted. And I was just like, wow, someone's going to pay me to learn. And then they said, what language do you want to learn? And I said, Pashto. And they were like, why is that? And I was like, well, it just seems like it will be the most interesting one. And it probably wasn't the most practical one, in the sense of, like, if I'd learned Arabic, I could have then, gone on and, I don't know, done business in the Arab world or something, or, whatever. Persia is an ancient civilization. Pashto was a tribal language spoken by 60 million mostly illiterate people, and I thought that'll do.
Well, it turned out to be a sound choice, right? Ultimately.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, all history makes sense in the rear.
It's all in perspective. Yeah, exactly.
So and so I did that, and I did my course, and that was fine. And then they had, like, the army had hired taxi drivers from Slough, because they were the only Afghans they could find, to teach us Pashto. So it was kind of pretty chaotic.
So highly qualified teachers, right?
No, none of them were language teachers. No, what they had was they were native speakers, and then a few of us banded together and, like, put some rigor into it.
Yeah.
And so then I went to Afghanistan, supposedly as an interpreter. That was completely, like, very, very quickly, that it's just so stupid that the British Army was paying. I mean, it's kind of indicative of the whole approach, but we were paying Brit officers to learn a language, then go be interpreters. But from almost all things, you can buy an interpreter in Kabul, like an Afghan, So anyway, but whatever. So through a series of events, I managed to get out in about 3 weeks. I got out of that, and then was kind of talked myself into trialing a new role, because I basically said to my boss, who was this colonel, we don't have a clue what's going on in Afghan society. Like, when I'd gone to Afghanistan, I mean, this is the thing. Before I went there, I had this in my mind's eye. I had this idea of all the books that I'd read when I was growing up. Like, it's going to be so sophisticated. We're going to have really good knowledge of what's going on in the society. We're going to be really carefully, like, pulling the strings, and, like, we're going to be, helping advance the Afghan government and all the good stuff. Like, I was a true believer.
Oh, what an illusion, right?
And I got there, and I was just like, oh my! It was stunning. It was absolutely stunning how poor the intelligence picture was. And by intelligence, I mean in a broader sense of actually what was going on in the society. Like, they were pretty good at knowing, like,
the micro level, who's moving,
or like there's a bomb attack. There's going to be there'll be some faction, like in a village, right? Someone will plant a bomb, an IED, and, like, someone else in the village will hate him, so they'll shop him to us, right? So we had a really good idea of, like, there's going to be an IED on that road or whatever, right? And that's easy. Like, if you offer a reward to your informants for every successful IED that's brought in, that's so easy. But did we have an idea even of those factions that were causing that? No. And any idea of the tribal dynamics? And, like, it was just unbelievable how poor and how simplistic. And you'd read these operations orders for, like, there's this operation going on here, we're going to go into this village and blah, blah, blah. And you look at it and go, wow, is this like a pastiche of an Orwellian, like, we're going to go in and spread the will of the Afghan government? I was like, who believes this?
Yeah.
And anyway, so I took, like,
but we believed it, right? I mean, we believed it. I mean, we really, like, I mean, as in,
did you believe it?
Well, I'll be totally frank. I mean, I never bought into the narratives, because I think I was maybe I was fortunate in having experienced the Balkans, or having had an intimate knowledge of the Balkans, to know that, nothing is what it seems. But I think, I was part of it, certainly. And while I try to induce some level of context in at least the reporting that I was responsible for, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I was also dumbfounded by some of the things we were doing as well, just like what you're saying. But without
Did
a
you not
doubt, you kind
also
of,
dig in? Did you not also not dig into it too much because actually subconsciously you knew that if you dug into it too much, it wouldn't add up,
you know
and so
exactly
it's
where it's going to
much
go.
easier to
Yeah.
psychologically defend yourself from that dissonance. Like we're all dissonance reducers as human beings, right? And you knew that what you were seeing on the ground didn't necessarily match the narrative, so you thought, you know what, I'm just not going to worry too much about the narrative and just get on with stuff because I'm just creating mental.
Yeah. And you also, and it's also part of the belonging, right? It's as you're talking, you know, you're there as part of a particular in group, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
it's a lot easier to and this is not, you know, I sleep easy at night because I'm comfortable that the decisions I was responsible for and decisions I made, I've done them with my own ethics in mind. So there's this is not some dark disclosure, but I think you end up being part of a much bigger system that it's a big machine that's just rolling, and you can fall on your sword very very easily if you so choose, but then you're not. Then you become part of the out group, right? You ultimately get banished by your chosen in group.
You could describe the same event, an attack on a village, training the police, paying a source for information, building a well. These are all activities that occurred in southern Afghanistan. And you can describe all of those events in about 3 or 4 different moral frameworks that give you slightly different answers. And it depends on what level of zoom you're looking at it, right? And so, the idea of a just war is, I think, incredibly difficult to apply to,
Yeah.
well, most conflicts. I think there are very few conflicts that you can apply the just war concept to,
Yeah,
actually.
because it's who's justice, right? I mean, and who interprets the justice.
Indeed it is.
That's absolutely fascinating. So just to now get back, so you ended up, right? So you were a fluent speaker and you were advising some pretty senior officers.
Yeah.
How did the story unfold from there?
So as a result of throwing my toys out the pram at the beginning of my first tour, they basically said, okay, look, you've got 6 months to just go and try and shape this job, like make this job a thing, right? Tell us what it looks like. And I had a really good guy who was my boss, a colonel, and who's now, it is heartening to see that the good ones do rise. He's now a 3-star general, and he told the battle group that I was working with to kind of facilitate my, if your job is talking to people, then you need to like get around, be protected, all that kind of stuff, right? So that was cool. And then basically the conclusion that we came to, that the role of that person, that officer who spoke Pashto and had a good knowledge of like Afghan tribal society, I suppose, in someone like Helmand, was their job was to build relationships with notables in the local community, tribal leaders, drug lords, landowners, militia commanders, all the usual council members, whatever. And then through building those relationships, just leverage them to both gather information on the society, so understand what's going on in the society, but also to try and influence that society. So it was a two-way communication role, i.e., it's a political officer, right? It's the same job that, the Brits and to a lesser degree the French did for hundreds of years in all the far-flung bits of their empire. And lots of other empires have done it as well. And again, obviously I'm not defending colonialism, but given that task, that was the way they came up with carrying it out. And I'm not really defending the war in Afghanistan. I think it was bullshit. But given that task, the best way of carrying that out is to generate people with expertise and language skills, and so they can build links with the local community. At the end of that 6 months, we'd had a good run. Like, it seemed to work. Like, we weren't blundering about so much. We really were starting to understand what was going on, a bit more nuanced. It wasn't kind of black and white, government, Taliban, all that kind of stuff. And coincidentally, like, a really senior general from the UK came to visit, a guy called David Richards, who ended up being the chief of the defence staff. And the colonel was like, I'd like you to give him a brief when he gets here on this. And coincidentally, in the UK, they'd started a project team that had basically been set the task to, how do we understand more about Afghan society? So these things came together. He said, brilliant. Can you write me something that I can give to them? And I'd already written a paper. So I said, here you go. Gave that to him. And that was right at the end of my tour. About a week later, I was getting off a plane in Oxfordshire, and I switched my phone on, and there was a message from the guy running that project team in the MOD, who said, we've just been given your paper by General Richards. Could you, I know you're on leave, I'm really sorry, but do you mind coming in? So I went in, and then that was it, really. They basically took that paper, turned it into what became DCSU, which is the Defence Cultural Specialist Unit. I spent that summer kind of working with them and with various other bits of the MOD to flesh it out. And then I went back out there for another long tour, like a 10, 11, no, it was the year-long tour. In that September, so I got back in May or something. No. And so I then went out, and then to follow me later on were other linguists. Obviously, the linguist training pipeline's kind of slow, takes a long time. So they then started like sending out linguists to me in 1s and 2s, and I trained them up. And
right, so you trained the follow-on guys as well.
Yeah. So that summer we ran a kind of trial course. What would the course look like for DCSU, which looks nothing like the one that you and I worked on for the Australian government. It's 10 years of benefit, but we ran that course, but that wasn't really working. It didn't quite touch the right notes. But so they used to come out to theatre, and I used to train them, and I used to give them a 3-day package, and I was just like, give me linguists and I can turn them into officers who are linguists. And so then I sat at brigade, and then we had one of those in each battle group, basically. And slowly we started developing, what was going on. And look, I don't want to overblow what we achieved. We didn't change the course of anything, but we did make it a bit less shit. The strategy was set in London and Washington, and that wasn't going to change. But given those set of tasks, we, I think, made our activities a little more nuanced, which means that there's less Afghans that are dead. Yeah, there's less Brits and Aussies, and Americans, whatever, coalition soldiers who are dead. And so, I think from that point of view, it was a success. But like I said, I don't want to overblow it. Like, we changed the whole.
No, of course. Yeah. No, I understand it. And I mean, like you said, the policy was set, and as we spoke before, ultimately by those who don't know what war is about and never felt war, which is, perhaps a separate, much longer discussion. But I think what would be good for me to hear is, particularly as someone who's also learned other languages and learned to live in different cultural codes, so to speak, or cultural programs, when you learn Pushtu and you started speaking to the locals, I guess, I'm guessing I know the answer. I mean, you started uncovering something you already knew you would uncover, and that is a completely different story. But to what extent was that true? Was this kind of an aha moment? Holy shit, we've got this all wrong, because I suspect you had an inkling that is the case, and then from there, I guess it was a matter of proving that hypothesis to be true. Is that how it unfolded, or what was that experience like?
Well, it took 4 years, right? I mean, I was in and out of Afghanistan for 4 years because I did a couple of years in uniform, and then, or like 18 months in uniform, and then after that, the army paid for my PhD to go, because I was basically going to leave the army to go and do a PhD, and they were like, "Don't leave. We'll pay for your PhD. Stay in the army." So then I wore jeans and a t-shirt and went back to Afghanistan to work as an advisor for the general, but also to collect my PhD research, which was basically interviewing people, just carrying on talking to the same network that I've been speaking to.
Yeah, just now recording it.
Yeah, well, making notes, but yeah. And so I knew right from the start that what the narrative was didn't match what I was seeing. That was immediately obvious. Almost within a week of getting into theatre, I was like, "What is this?" Could I articulate that in any other way than to say that's bullshit? No. And I think many people don't get beyond that because they don't have the luxury of, the time to explore it like I was. Like I literally created my own job to allow myself to explore this problem, which the army, created the space to allow me to do because they found that useful. And then I went on and did a PhD on the same question: what is this war about? And so over time, I became, I guess, more articulate about what was going on. But really, but it's not just that, so many things I had to bring together. Like there was the language skills, there was the network I was building, there was lots of reading about Afghanistan in general, like in terms of, or the south of Afghanistan in particular, like, but tribal system, politics, religion, all that stuff, drugs trade, all these different things that you need to kind of understand what the dynamics are. So what you might call regional expertise. And then in addition, I had to do a huge amount of genning up on, because I knew nothing about it, like all this different kind of conflict, scholarship, like, civil wars, counterinsurgency, all that kind of stuff, all the stuff like Clausewitzian stuff, like all that stuff. So a huge amount of conflict scholarship as well. And so bringing all those and I'd go to Afghanistan and work and read, and then I come back and do a period of study, and then I'd learn a bit more language, and do more language. Then I'd come and write some stuff, and so there was a constant process of doing and thinking and writing and reading that went on for 4, 5. I mean, in total, I was involved in Afghanistan from the beginning when I started learning Kurdish to the end in about 7 years.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And well, I guess I'm still involved in Afghanistan in that sense, but and I think it took a lot of that time to pick apart all of that stuff and really defining it down to what it is now, which is kind of, that was not a black-white thing. That was driven by land and water and very kind of parochial concerns, revenge, feuds, all that kind of stuff. That was what drove most of the violence, and people selected ideologies in order to give themselves cover to carry out that violence. And and then understanding the interaction between outsiders who supply kind of the ideology and the funding for the fighting, and then the insiders who are providing the manpower and the intelligence, and then understanding that the most rare of those 4 things is the intelligence, and that's what insiders use to manipulate outsiders into funding their local wars. You can see each of these developments and layers as I gathered more evidence and understood things. Like for a long time, and I guess this is why it's so exciting, for a long time in Afghanistan, all the time, it was like peeling the layers off an onion. Like you peel one layer off, you're like, that's what it is. And then you go and have a few more conversations. You're like, peel off another layer, and you're like, that's what it is. And then it's so on and so, and it keeps going. And I think now I've got to a point where my understanding is fairly stable, but that, has taken a long And like a couple of people who reviewed the book were like, they've said that they could see in the book that it was like the scales were dropping from my eyes. Like as I was going
Yeah,
through this process,
yeah,
I was,
yeah.
that's one way of describing
Yeah,
it.
and I think that's the benefit of having someone really understand the cultural context. And the book you're referring to is the An Intimate War, an oral history of the Helmand Conflict, 1978 to
Mm,
2012,
mm.
which then ultimately got you into some hot water, right? So it was for it to even be published, right? That was the big challenge. Even though if I understand it correctly, it was essentially your PhD thesis reworked into a publishable book. Is that, can you tell us a little bit about
Yeah, the
that?
PhD that the army had paid for.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Yeah, right.
so after my 6 years in the full-time army, I went back to the reserves, and then I went traveling in Africa for a while, and then I came back, and by that point, I'd but it got a publisher had like, oh, we'll take that, and obviously you need to rewrite it a bit, but it was, make it a bit less PhD and a bit more narrative-y. And obviously, it was the PhD that they'd paid for, which they had. I can't tell you the praise that I got from the army because they turned it into everyone sent it around to everyone. It's all part of their big lessons learned thing, blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
right.
And as a PhD, right, it automatically is a public document, like it goes on the shelves at the University of London, blah blah blah. So it's all out there. And I'd been obviously very careful that everything in there was unclassified, and didn't draw on any of the more sensitive pieces of information that I was. And I know that that's the case because I developed most of all of the information that went into that, but
Hmm.
and I classified it myself as unclassified because these were
Yeah,
simple these were overt conversations that I
yeah.
had with lots of Afghans. And that was all fine. And then, unfortunately, the army had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction and said that I needed to submit it for vetting. And I said, well, here's another copy, but you've actually had it for about 18 months by this point. And as an unclassified public document. And then I feel so sorry for this guy. They got a lance corporal to read through the whole thing and write down, because obviously officers are too lazy to do that sort of thing themselves, and write down like where it broke the Official Secrets Act. And his conclusion, which I know because whilst I was being hauled in over the coals, they let me look at some email chains to demonstrate that I needed to wind my neck in and not publish the book. But unfortunately, they scrolled down too far. And this guy's conclusion was, there's nothing in here that breaks the Official Secrets Act, but it's really, really embarrassing.
Yeah, yeah.
And up until that point, I was willing to be amenable. So I was like, how can we, what do you want me to do? Like, blah, blah, blah. And then I read that and I was like, oh man, this is bullshit. You're just like, what's not happening is you're not banning this or bullying me to not publish it because of your embarrassment. That's why we end up with really poorly executed wars. So then I got a direct order from the Assistant Chief of the General Staff not to publish.
Right. Okay, that's pretty senior.
which I thought was an odd. Well, I thought it was an odd use of a military order, but
Yeah.
but I don't know. I think he misunderstood like the relative value in my mind of publishing the book versus my reserve commission. And so I resigned. And then a friend of mine was the defense correspondent for the Times. So I rang him up and said, I don't know, you might be interested, mate. I was just thinking it'll probably get like a small thing on page 15 or something. Anyway, it was a slow news day, so it was the front page of the Times of London. MOD tries to ban it. No, Army tries to ban its own book.
Oh wow, okay. Talk about some free advertising for you though. Jeez.
Oh wow, it was amazing. And yeah, so I spent the next 2 days like traipsing around TV studios and doing media like UK, US, internationally. Same thing happened when it came out a bit later on in Denmark. Front page there, lots of Danish troops in Helmand. So yeah, and it got some good reviews and has done well. A lot of people have said that it's a really good example of the recent crop of books that have come out in this sort of recent period of Afghanistan. So that's nice. And it's kind of giving a voice to all the Hermanis, right? They were kind of 90% illiterate. So the only way to tell the story of the war from their side was to sit down and talk, drink tea and talk to them, and then write that down. Like everything that's written about Afghanistan is written by outsiders, like 95% of it.
Yeah. And I think that's sorry, go on.
Come on. No, go for it.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, I think that's very common for most conflicts, right? I mean, it's generally the outsider that comes in as the peacemaker, peace builder, knows how to democratize, make it a liberal democracy in most cases, and we're going to try and include you into this Western idea of what
yawn.
Yeah,
those are all the narratives, but they're bollocks. Like they don't match the actual behavior of the countries intervening, the diplomats, the soldiers on the ground. Like I think they believe them. In fact, I know they believe them because I've worked with hundreds of people who, both in the army and after the army, they believe what they're saying, but their actions don't match their words. And so the natives, if I can use that term, in somewhere like Afghanistan or wherever, look at this divergence, this dichotomy between what the outsiders are saying and what they're doing, and they're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And so with respect to all the literature in Afghanistan, there's so much money swilling around the Afghan war, like trillions of dollars, that you don't need much than a tiny percentage of trillions of dollars to generate hundreds of thousands of pages of reports and books and all that kind of stuff. And funnily enough, it's all written in the vernacular of whatever the dominant, whatever the paradigm is of the people who are paying for it all, which is counterinsurgency, good, bad, blah, blah, blah.
The colloquially known as the self-licking ice cream, right? It's just a revolving door of the narrative that keeps promoting itself for the sake of
development consultants go and become development lecturers at university, go and set up their own firms, then go and work for USAID, then soldiers become soldiers, then they become private military contractors, they become academics that write about conflict, he says, speaking about himself, so on and so forth.
Like, but it's a monstrous industry, right? I mean, the obviously war is a huge industry, but peace building, peacemaking, development work, it's a monstrous industry. Well, both you and I have done some work in there. You've done a lot more than I have, but my eyes were open. I spent some time in Iraq as a development consultant, and it was just insane, the figures that were being thrown around for various consultants coming in to, just retell the same story in a different way, to apply the same solution in. I
don't mean to be cynical, but I'm amazed that those people can look you straight in the eye. Because far from, beyond being ineffectual, most of the time they're exacerbating the conflicts. Because, I'll give you an example. Like, you're a development contractor, consultant going into Baghdad, right? And your job is to, I don't know, write a paper on the opportunities for reform in the Interior Ministry or something, right? You're nodding because probably you've seen
exactly.
some other
Yeah,
fucking bullshit,
yeah, yeah,
right? Which is written with zero knowledge of Iraq, not written by an Arabic speaker, someone who's literally just come in for a week, spoken to like 4 people, all of them white. They've done their token trip to the ministry to talk to the minister, right? But to get them in the country, you probably had to, bribe the embassy or the whatever to get the visa done.
pay the fixer.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, paid the fixer. Right. So
yeah,
I'm sure you've had this experience.
yeah,
And yeah, at the same time, there'll be someone else writing papers on how to stop corruption in Iraq, right? And someone else will be writing papers on ensuring civilian control of the military or something, all this stuff. And actually, all of it's disconnected. None of it is done with any knowledge of why the systems are like they are. They're like, here's what the system is like in the Iraqi Interior Ministry. Here's what we want it to be like. Therefore, these are the reforms they need to do. But there's no real knowledge of why the systems are like that because they don't understand how Iraq works, right? And then because of those, they will try and then institute some of those reforms via basically bribing people with development funding. If you create a directorate of internal policing, whatever, that's one of the reforms we need. We need a corruption watchdog. If you institute that, we will, pay for X, Y, and Z, new photocopies in the office or whatever it is, right? And then and then this sort of game goes on because really what the consultants are interested in, or the development agencies, is going home at the end of their time, being able to point to something and go, I did that, right?
yeah.
But if everyone's doing that, at the end of 20 years, you have this situation like we're having in Afghanistan now. When you look at Afghanistan, after 20 years of foreign intervention, all right, trillions of dollars. And what was a statistic I heard on the radio this morning? Half of Afghan children are malnourished. We're not talking about have they got access to the latest antiretrovirals. We're not talking about are they going to university. They don't have enough food. After 20 years, half of Afghan children do not have enough food. So that tells you something about what Western intervention achieves.
So what should we do? What I mean, that's a monstrous question, and you've been very kind with your time already. But
yes, but where? What should we do where? Because everywhere's got a different.
Well, even in Afghanistan, what should we have done in Afghanistan?
So there was potentially an argument right at the beginning, after the toppling of the Taliban, or rather, once the Taliban fucked off, and the Bonn conference. There was a window of opportunity there to really reshape what was going on. And in the Bonn conference, what they did, just to remind your listeners, was they basically enshrined a government in Afghanistan by one of the factions of the civil war, the Northern Alliance, and kind of put a figurehead on Karzai, who was from the Pashtun, the southern Pashtun, who traditionally produced the leaders of Afghanistan. And then they supported that government to fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remnants and then, rebuild the country. But of course, in a civil war, if you come in and end the civil war and then immediately start supporting one side in that civil war, probably what you're going to do is fuel that civil war or at least reignite it, right? And that's basically what happened. Everyone waited for a couple of years to see what would happen, and then by 2004, things were starting to slide away. The sides were starting to divide because one of the main reasons was that government, in inverted commas, that the international community supported were utterly rapacious in the way that they pursued their previous enemies from the Civil War, in the way that they accumulated profits from the drug trade, in a way that they stole international development money. And effectively, the international community, basically the Americans, didn't keep an eye on that and allowed it to happen because their only goal was to pursue Taliban and Al-Qaeda remnants, right? Yeah. Accepting that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are pretty different things with pretty different goals. And just because they had a marriage of convenience during one period of time does not mean that they are joined at the hip forever. Again, think about our earlier conversation about ideology, right? You know, from a Western point of view, they're both crazy Islamists, fundamentalists, whatever. So they're obviously the same thing, you know.
Black and white, their enemy. Yeah.
So I think there was a window of opportunity, and I've got no idea whether this would work, right? But it seems to me like it would have been a bit more successful than what we did, which was to accept that at that point in 2001, Afghanistan had been at war for about 25 years, give or take, depending on when you date the 23 years, you know, from the revolution, but really there was conflict brewing before that. And say, well, you know, 20 years civil war, country utterly devastated, utterly devastated. It's a golden opportunity there to perhaps look at some sort of international administration. So the UN, one assumes, would head that up, probably led, or certainly the on-the-ground face of it would be led by Muslim countries, Indonesia. You know, I don't know whether Indonesia is a game for this, but you know, this is a major Indonesian country, but out of the region, right? So that's an obvious benefit. Obviously, it'd be international, right? So you have other countries involved. Wouldn't have any countries in the region. So India, Pakistan, China, bordering countries wouldn't be part of that.
They have a vested stake in how it unfolds. Yeah.
And then, you know, it'd be funded largely by you know, Europe, America, all that kind of stuff. And the idea would be that you'd have some sort of international administration. You know, we've had them before in Cambodia, and you know, there's and where you're from as well. And the idea is that you go into it with effectively a peace brokering mentality, where you accept that we've got a whole bunch of frozen conflicts now over land and whatever that have been swept aside or caused by the last 20 years of war, and we need to, from the bottom, we need to start, we need to kind of looking at law, we need to kind of get people where they're from, we need to provide basic services, all that kind of stuff. But critically, the most important thing we need to do, the two things are, as always, we need to provide some sort of justice mechanism that's accepted, that enables things like land disputes to be solved, and potentially that we need to talk about war crimes. Are there any war crimes? What are we going to do about that? Are we going to punish them? Are we going to have a truth and reconciliation? What are we going to do? And by the way, there are kind of strong antecedents for this in Pashtun culture around this, so it's not like maybe starting with a blank slate. And then we need to look at, you know, security, as always. Security and justice, the two most important things. And security needs to, as always, be impartial, like justice. And so how would you provide that? Well, one thing Afghanistan's got is manpower, but officership could perhaps be provided by, I don't know, Nepalese, Indonesians, you know, something like that.
But I think it seems, again, the undercurrent there is this idea of understanding the local context, you know, whether that is building a sense of identity. So if we're talking about, say, Indonesia, the kind of Islamic cultural understanding and nuances, that would ultimately be a much easier bridge to build, or to create a sense of belonging between, or almost an in-group between, you know, those coming from outside with those inside. In other words, to then, you know, lead by example and help shape the future of a country, in this case, Afghanistan. Right? Is that because that's I think that's, when we look at your book, Why We Fight, that seems to be the subcontext, that there are ultimately, two reasons: the status and belonging are the key motivators to help us solve a number of critical social problems, which maybe we'll touch on in a second. But is that where you're going?
I think what you end up with, right, with this situation is, so you basically start out with kind of manpower being provided by Afghans, but all leadership and administrative functions being provided by this international body, right? Rather than having an Afghan government, which is, by the way, one side from the civil war, and an international coalition, and they're separate, supposedly evolving. No, they're one thing. And gradually what happens as you train up cadres of Afghan civil servants, you lift up and off until eventually you're then, over 20 years or something, you're moving into, in the latter part of that period, elections and all that kind of stuff. But instead what we did was we went in, created an Afghan government, immediately set it up to become the protagonists in a conflict, which we then support, blindly supporting them and pursuing their enemies, exacerbating all the divides in the country. We tipped loads of money without understanding what we're doing, and then had elections, and oh guys, it's a democracy.
And everyone that was against it, even remotely, was a Talib, right? Regardless, right? It was such a clear line, that
rather than that guy in the government who you're supporting stole my land. Like, I'm on the side of justice here, right? None of that was recognised. Oh, he's a Talib, and then also not putting the appropriate emphasis on justice and security, instead focusing on other things. And I'm not saying these other things aren't important: health, road building. These things are all important. But if you don't get to grips with solving people's problems, justice, and providing a low level of security that stops interpersonal violence, you're fucked. You can build as many schools as you like. It will all backslide. And that's exactly what's happened. There was basically zero reform of the Afghan justice system. The police were the most rapacious militias around, supported by the international community.
Yeah, and that's tragic. And I think this is, if we've got a couple more minutes, the problems you're referring to, you explore in depth in your book, Why We Fight, which is a book I highly recommend. I recently finished it. And you talk about the 5 basic problems that need to be solved, which therefore create individual human violence in groups. And one of them being identity, next one being hierarchy, then trade, then disease, and group mandated punishment. And you've touched on some of these. Could you maybe explore a little bit more about those and why they are so important?
Yeah, sure. So look, I mean, in Why We Fight, I talk about the fact that there's the benefits to living in groups, right? And there's benefits to living in bigger groups versus smaller groups. But that's only the case if those groups function and they are coherent. And they only function and are coherent if they solve those 5 problems. So identity, like, who are we? Where's the boundary of the in-group and the out-group? By the way, all of these 5 problems have mechanisms in our cognition that help us sense them on a subconscious level. So identity, well, that's the in-group, out-group mechanism I just
talked about. So in other words, you mean rooted in evolution, in a sense, even that we can now cognitively formulate them as a cognitive understanding, but it's very much rooted in things that we weren't necessarily consciously aware of in our past. Yeah.
Exactly that. They're subconscious mechanisms.
Yeah.
That, and I'll sort of mention them as I go through each one. They're subconscious mechanisms that, as we have grown as a species from tribes to tribal confederations to chieftainships to countries to quasi-global empires like we have now, as we've grown through those, we've consciously constructed systems of thought that reflect those 5 problems and those emotional mechanisms. So religion is about solving those 5 problems, really. or at least it speaks to those 5 problems in a way. And democracy or capitalism, all of these systems of thought that we have, these societal frameworks, if you like, speak to those 5 problems. They offer they say, these are our 5 solutions to those 5 problems. If you believe in monarchy or whatever, that's, or you're British, this is how the British have solved those 5 problems. So you've got identity, right, which is in groups, out groups, and that's kind of who are we, what are the costs of membership of our group, what does it mean to be British,
and who we're not, right? Yeah, who we're not, importantly as well, right?
Absolutely, we are not French.
Yeah.
And I can say that I'm such a francophile that I feel
just like we can say we're not British.
Absolutely. Well, we as in the Australians. Right?
Yeah. I'm assuming that identity.
When you say we,
a man of many faces. Yeah.
I found the same thing when I was, one of my interview subjects for my PhD was Helmandis, who lived in London. And it was really touching because they would use the phrase we, and I didn't always know whether they meant we British or we Helmandi, which is touching. Anyway, identity, in groups, out groups, right? Who are we? Yeah. And that's that mechanism, right? That in-group, out-group mechanism. Hierarchy is about who's in charge, why are they in charge of our group, and kind of critically, what do we accept as the distribution of wealth, if you like? Like, every society accepts that those in charge, pretty much every society kind of has a tacit acceptance of those in charge should have a bit more, right? And obviously the question is to what degree? Obviously that's the key question, and that's a lot of politics is about that, national politics,
and a lot of instability,
and a lot of instability. Absolutely. I'm just putting a proposal together for a book now. You heard it here first, exclusive,
on the Voices of War.
Exclusive. I'm putting together a proposal for a book about World War III. Because I think that in the 2020s we've probably got a more than 50% chance of ending up in a global conflict. And one of the factors that I talk about 7 structural trends, and one of them is inequality. Anyway, we diverge. The mechanism that underlies that hierarchy thing is status. We all sense status. We've got hormonal pathways that enable us or cause us to seek status, and we've got we're very, very good at judging. Within a quarter of a second, people are able to judge the status dynamics in a room, like who's, it's really, really interesting.
So who's pulling the strings? Yeah. Who's running the strings?
Trade is really about. I've called it trade, but at its most basic, it's like reciprocity, right? If I hunt for. If I capture this bison and share it with you, over the next month, if you catch something and I don't get anything, then I'm expecting to get something back, right? And that idea of fairness, like, is it a fair trade?
Yeah.
And that's been demonstrated. This isn't just humans have this. Like chimpanzees, they've done experiments on chimpanzees where, with grapes, chimpanzees love grapes. And if you give like grapes to some and cucumbers to the others, like they sense the injustice. The injustice is fascinating. And obviously all these things are interlinked, like who we are, who's in charge, what's fair. These are all kind of interlinked, right? But so is the rest of your brain, right? They're not separate. It's not like my arm moving up and down and my leg moving from side to side. In your brain, all the mechanisms are conjoined. Disease, fascinatingly, when I wrote the book in 2008, and it's coming out in paperback this year, Why We Fight, so watch for that. But when I wrote the book in 2018, I was like, disease, it is really important. The disgust mechanism is what underlies it. But basically it's about when you've got groups of humans who share genetics, right, as people who are related, then disease is very easy to spread amongst So how we deal with health and disease and what the rules are and who we let in and don't let in to protect ourselves from disease, sexually transmitted disease, all that kind of stuff. So that's really important. And I was like, well, should I include that? It doesn't seem like a major shaper. And then obviously COVID happened. So I was like, good, glad. And then finally, punishment. Like, how do we, of all those rules above, how do we punish people if they break the rules? And that's again is like, what do we feel is a fair punishment? Like, most societies don't think we should punish. If you commit a crime but you're declared insane, we shouldn't punish you, right? In France, there's la crime passionnel, right? Where if you murder someone, if you walk in on your wife and she's with another man and you kill him,
crime of passion,
France, right? So that's what they, and most people don't. We shouldn't punish, or no, we should care for elderly and disabled people and stuff like that. So these rules on care and punishment and what we think is appropriate in our society. So we need to manage that as well, because otherwise it feeds into imbalances in society. And those are the five things that we need to get right. And if you look at laws, this is always the thing I say to people they should do, is they should go and put up any law you like, right, on the Australian government website. Any law will be a derivation of one of those five problems, if not more than one of those problems.
That's really interesting, because I mean, as you're talking, I mean, I can naturally recognize this in a lot of the conflicts that I've studied or gotten to know intimately. But as you were talking now, and perhaps this is easy, right? It's a very easy target, but I think it helps contextualize it. Just thinking back, given that we're recording this in late January 2021, what's happening in the US with Trumpism and Trump and the cult of Trump, ultimately, the storming of the Capitol and so on. It really fits all of these so neatly, right? Well, first, when we're looking at the identity component, who's in and out. I mean, it's so obvious.
What does it mean to be American?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it's and the sense of the loyal, true American that's going to stand up for against the stolen election and so on, and the narrative that embraces. Never mind.
So you tell me, mate, because I grew up in London, right? So whilst I've experienced war and studied them and all the rest of it, I never grew up in it. And I've never lived in a country as it was descending in civil war, although I was in South Sudan as it was descending in civil war. So have you, when you look at the US now, do you think, and particularly the political narratives, politicians, militias, that kind of stuff, do you look at that and think, I've seen that before?
Well, I've actually been funny you said that, because I've started drafting an article called "The Balkanization of the US." Right? It's it very much, and it's very much the play on the words, right? Because the term Balkanization, as we know, has come into the kind of vernacular into usage because of what's happened in the Balkans, and that signifies that it's the breaking up of a whole. And many have now discussed. Whether the US is the brink of,
but the causes are a bit different, right? Because as far as I can tell, it seems to me that the main thing that's got the America to where it is now is it exposed its society and economy to the ravages of the globalized economy without appropriate health, education, and social welfare supports in place for that population, and that has led to. That's the cause uncause, and then that has led to these other ideological polarizations. And what does it mean to be American?
Which are merely narratives to justify that, right? They're merely narratives to explain it, right? They're not necessarily. Which is why I think there's actually a lot more similarity in what happened in the Balkans. While the context different, it's a completely different economies, different setup, different nations, different size, different geopolitical dynamics that surround it, and so on and so forth. But I think it still comes down to even the five reasons that you've given. Trade was certainly one. There was a massive aspect of the fall down or the breakup of Yugoslavia, or even identity that was again imposed.
So it seems to me and I really don't know the Balkans that well. It seems to me that the similarity between the Balkans and between the US is that there's a population disquiet, right? In the Balkans, it was caused by the breakup of Yugoslavia and that sense of identity. And in the US, it's been caused by just half of the country being economically devastated by globalization and the other half getting very rich out of it. And so that has led to levels of societal disquiet, which causes people to disattach from the old identity and to reattach to new identities. And people are competing for those identities. So in the Balkans, it was, leaders of different ethnic groups. And in the States, it's the Proud Boys or whatever, the right-wing militias, the Antifa, the Democrats. The politicians have got their own militias, amazing. And so,
well, some of them are calling themselves now Trump's army, the Proud Boys and that sort of. I mean, they're literally embracing these kind of martial narratives, and obviously have very much showed that on the 6th of January. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and so I just wonder if that's the real commonality. Like, you can have a disattachment from a sense of belonging or a group that you belong to for various reasons. And I guess after Yugoslavia broke up, I guess the economy crashed, right?
Well, I mean, it crashed beforehand, right? There was part of the lead up to it.
And that was part of the okay, great.
Part of it, right?
Okay.
So it was huge debt, that Tito had and carried, and the fall of the Soviet Union certainly helped because it was a huge economic attachment to the
funding,
and of course to the West. The oil crisis had a huge impact, which really mounted the debt. So the economic crisis preceded the kind of identity crisis, right?
Okay.
Because it was
in that case, it's identical to what's going on in the US.
That's right. So, and which is why I think there are far more, like you're saying, far more similarities, because it was, you could almost, and in fact, I think I've read somewhere people comparing even a few years back Milosevic to Trump, right? It's kind of, he's hitting the nerves of those who are in many ways left behind, or those who are in some way feel that a grave injustice, they've experienced a grave injustice at the hands of this other, right? Now, in the Balkan case, the other was the other ethnic groups who wanted to separate from this national whole and were stealing and taking more than they deserved, and of course in the US that's very much the technocrats, the swamp, right? It's the 1% and etc., which superimpose globalization on that. It's a.
I heard an interview on the World Service that I thought was fascinating, where this BBC journalist was interviewing a Trump supporter. It was before the 6th, and it was talking about, the whole, because he was still saying it was a stolen election and all that stuff. And this guy was saying that it was very heartfelt. He was saying that he'd never really felt, for decades now, no one had been looking out for him. And then Trump came along and started looking out for him. And he started choking up and crying. Such was the force of his emotion about how he felt that Trump was finally speaking up for him. Like, nobody was speaking up for him. And obviously millions of people like him. And when I heard that, I thought, fuck, America's got US Civil War is a major conflict risk over the next decade. Major conflict.
Yeah, especially given how many weapons there are in the country and the availability of weapons, which of course is one key contributing factor to the likelihood of violence. It is amazing. I mean, but in many ways, like you were saying, if you start stripping back the onion, right? I mean, the International Crisis Group, it's really funny. They've kind of released, 10 wars to watch or whatever. And, they were thinking, but should they have, America or not? And I listened to a podcast about it, the need to actually now study the US as a potential conflict, which, as the beacon of democracy, as the, as the land of the free and the home of the brave and so on, it's a fascinating place for the world to be,
Terrifying place for the world to be. Like a US civil wars tend to suck in outsiders, right? Unless they're in places that nobody gives a fuck about. Excuse me if you're from a small country, but civil wars like that, the inevitably will suck in outsiders, and at a minimum, Central America, Mexico, and South America are likely to be drawn into that conflict. I don't really see how Canada can fail to not, at some point, not be pulled into like a major civil war in the US. I don't really I don't know. Like, people might in Europe and in East Asia decide to stay out of that, but at a minimum, I would expect the Americas to be drawn into that conflict, and that's a billion people.
And then the flow-on effects, from that globally, whether it's been trade or in just reputation, or or even the absence of an America on the global stage. Of course, that vacuum will be filled by
so
other
anyway,
states,
you need
right?
somebody, right? Yeah. So you need somebody to kind of, you need a framework, like everything. You need a framework, and you need something or someone to enforce it.
Yeah, that solves these 5 problems, which I find fascinating. I mean, I think this is this was a really fascinating read. And I think it does explain a lot in how the world functions. As you said, pull up any law, and I think it'll fit. Will we always need to fight, Mike? Is it? I mean, we know it's a human condition, right? But is it an enduring one?
Do you mean group fighting?
Yeah. So
Yeah. So I think that, actually, I think basically, if you look at human macro history, the levels of violence have gone down, relatively speaking. In absolute terms, they've gone up because the population's gone up. But actually, in terms of like deaths per head, they've gone down massively. And the reason they've gone down massively is because of, we live in bigger groups than we used to, right? There's an inverse correlation between levels of violence and group size. Groups go up, levels of violence go down, because by definition, groups internally are
cohesive in some,
right? Absolutely.
And there's an identity that keeps them together.
Yep. And if there are bigger groups, there are less of them, which means there's less chance of war starting accidentally, right? And this happens all the time. People think that war is like a deliberate design. More often than not, it just, underlying structural trends get triggered by random events, right? Everyone talks about World War One being about Ferdinand, Sarajevo, all the rest of it. But actually, if it wasn't that, something else would have sparked it off. There were huge structural trends in Europe at that time that were leading to...
It was just a spark, ultimately, that lit it all up.
Absolutely. And so I completely forgot, what was your question? Do we always need to fight? Yeah. So basically, right, we've got this macro history, lower levels of violence, bigger groups, right? We're now at a stage in 2020 of being on the cusp of a global society. It might not seem like it, but we've sort of been there for the last 50 years. Like, the nation state's the last successful level of organization that we've gone to. We've got some supranational stuff like the EU and trading blocks and ECOWAS and stuff like that. But they're not fully successful in the sense of solving the 5 problems like the nation state was, right? And so the question is, perhaps we'll jump to a regional level where those 5 problems are solved at a regional level, or perhaps, the EU's definitely having a good go at that. Or perhaps we'll jump to a global society. The problem is, at the moment, right, we've got loads of problems that fit between those 2 levels that aren't being solved, that can't be solved at a national level and aren't being solved at a global level. Migration, data sharing, collapse of maritime ecosystems, climate change, terrorism, international tax evasion. Like, I could just go on and on and on. There's so many problems that are building up in the system because we can't solve them at the national level, and we won't solve them at the global level. So it seems to me we're at which is why I'm writing this book, right, about World War III. We are at an inflection point. We either need to get our act together on a global level and start solving problems, or we will end up in a major war.
Yeah. Because the tensions are building, right? Just like you used the example of World War One. I mean, the tensions were building, and the tensions are. I mean, for anybody even remotely keeping abreast of what's happening
Yeah,
globally, the
yeah,
tensions are building in a number of different areas. And
they are.
what you suggesting is that perhaps there will be another, Ferdinand in Sarajevo, that will ignite it all again, right?
And the thing is, I think that here's the danger for me is that modern political systems and the commentariat overprivilege rationality when it comes to war. They can pull up spreadsheets and whatnot that say no, everything's getting better, we'll be fine, no one's going to go to war, that's too stupid. Like we've heard this before. What they fail to recognize is that war is actually an emotional act. Not a rational act. Of course it's not a rational act. Of course it's not rational, because if it was rational, we wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Nobody wins. Sun Tzu, there's no example of a nation that's benefited from prolonged warfare. True then, true now. Everyone gets poorer. Okay, so by definition, it's not a rational act, it's an emotional act, which means that you can't predict it. And, the basic argument of the forthcoming book, I hope it once, if the proposal gets accepted by the publisher, is that there are a number of structural trends in the world at the moment that are progressing. And I'm not going to pontificate about triggers, because in a sense that doesn't really matter. What matters is where these trends come together and increase fragility in the system. Therefore, almost anything could spark it off. And so that's really where I think we're at. And obviously that fragility is caused by many of these problems that sit between the global and the national level. The problems, these global problems end up manifesting themselves within countries. So inequality in the US has been caused by, China and Eastern Europe joining, the labor in those countries joining the global trading system, leading to deflation, leading to the people holding assets getting richer and those working for wages getting poorer. Global trends manifest themselves within countries, which then cause those countries to stop acting in a constructive way on an international level. They pull out of agreements, treaties, and that makes the system more fragile. And then politicians and leaders in those countries are forced to act almost as a way of re-establishing the coherence of their own nations. The disquiet felt within America, through inequality or migration or whatever it is reimposed by the clarity of war. War imposes emotional clarity, because all of a sudden, remember, we come back full circle, right, to where we started. War strips bare and exposes the brass tacks. It leads to clarity. And so the disquiet that's coming about in many countries and regions around the world through migration, climate change, inequality, etc., it can be reclarified by war, because then we know who we belong to.
And who's a fight,
and who we're fighting, who's in charge. We know all this stuff.
Well, I mean, sorry, go on.
Well, finally, like, war tends to solve these problems, right? War reduces inequality massively. If you think about it, war is about putting money into guns and firing them up, and then it explodes and the money disappears. It's literally a destroyer of capital by definition. So a pandemic, so a whatever, right? And so war does solve those problems. It reimposes clarity, and it tends to solve the problems that cause the war to break out in the first place. But the question is there a better way of solving those problems without resorting to war? And that, I think, is the big, question of the 2020s. And I'd put it at no better than 50-50 that we managed to escape it, or that we managed to fall into it.
Which is very sobering thought. And I think, when you look at it in the context of, even just Trump's sentence of, and you need to fight like hell, or you won't have a country anymore. It really puts the emphasis on the importance of that, because the regular person, if you're looking at the bell curve, the 68% might look at that and go, oh yeah, whatever, that's just rhetoric. Well, it might be, but to the to the 12% up front that are drinking the Kool-Aid, that is the ultimate call to arms. That's now we are lock and loaded, we're going, and
that 30% want emotional clarity. That's what they want.
Simplified for me, who's the bad guy?
Yeah. And also, who are we?
Yeah.
Who are we? Who's the bad guy? Who's in charge? So calming.
Yeah.
And we can reimpose that clarity through social safety nets, enhancing their, material prospects, retraining, all that kind of stuff. We can do all that kind of stuff. But I fear it may be too late in America. I don't know. We'll have to see. It's all there.
Mike, it's been a fascinating chat. Thank you for giving me so much of your time. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Very sobering conversation, but insightful as every engagement with you. Thanks very much, mate. Appreciate it, and stay safe.
Thanks, man. You too.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.